good evening, and welcome, wherever you are listening from, whether it's a quiet bedroom, a cozy corner of your home, or a peaceful space where the world outside begins to fade. I invite you to settle in. Take a deep breath, and let your mind drift gently through time. Tonight, we embark on a calm and thoughtful journey into the past. A story of forgotten centuries, flickering candlelight in dark stone chambers, and the quiet resilience of ideas waiting to bloom. It's a chapter of history often shrouded in mystery and speculation. A time when ancient cities crumbled, kingdoms rose and fell, and across the landscape of medieval Europe, the Church stood as both a beacon of order and a gatekeeper of knowledge. As the night stretches before us, we'll softly wander through this era, not in haste, but with gentle curiosity. Along the way, we'll meet scholars, monks, rulers, and everyday people whose lives, in many ways, shape the world we live in now. So, close your eyes, if you wish, and let the story begin. The period we're about to visit is often known by a name that carries a certain weight. The Dark Ages. It's a term many have heard, though its meaning has shifted and softened over time. In the simplest sense, it refers to the centuries following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, beginning around the 5th century and stretching, depending on who you ask, to somewhere between the 10th and 12th centuries. Why dark? Historians once believed this was an era of intellectual stagnation and cultural decline, a time when art, science, and philosophy dimmed, and much of the classical knowledge of Greece and Rome faded into obscurity. The bustling cities of antiquity grew quiet, great libraries were lost to fire and war, and what remained of Europe fractured into countless small kingdoms and tribal territories. In the midst of this uncertainty, one institution rose steadily, offering structure, certainty, and solace to people who faced daily hardships. That institution was the Christian Church. As civil governments crumbled, the Church became more than a place of worship. It became a source of leadership, a preserver of tradition, and, over time, the single most powerful force in medieval Europe. The Church's influence reached into every corner of life, from the fields of peasants to the courts of kings. Tonight, we'll gently explore how this growing authority shaped the course of human progress, and perhaps whether it held it back. But for now, let's continue softly as the story unfolds. And so, as we step quietly into this distant past, a gentle question lingers in the cool evening air. Was the progress of humanity ever truly held back in the shadows of history? Did those long, uncertain centuries silence voices of discovery? Or did they simply hide them away, waiting for a more welcoming time to be heard? Perhaps progress never truly stops. It only changes shape, taking quieter, subtler forms when the world grows dark. Tonight, together, we'll wander through those shadows, to listen for the faint echoes of forgotten ideas, and see what stories they might share. As the final days of the Western Roman Empire drew to a close, a quiet uncertainty began to settle over the lands it once ruled. For centuries, Rome had been a beacon of order, with its paved roads stretching across vast territories, its legions marching in perfect formation, and its cities bustling with markets, theatres, and baths. It was a civilization of structure, with laws, libraries, and grand public forums where ideas were debated beneath open skies. But by the late 5th century, that steady heartbeats began to falter. The reasons for Rome's decline were many, woven together like strands of an old, fraying tapestry. Economic troubles weakened its foundations. Corruption crept into its halls of power. The relentless pressure of invasions from beyond its borders chipped away at its strength. And, in time, the unthinkable happened. The eternal city itself was sacked. In the year 410, the Visigoths, a migrating people from the north, breached the city walls. What followed was not a single swift collapse, but a gradual, uneven unraveling. Over the next decades, wave after wave of tribal groups would sweep across the remnants of Roman territory. The Vandals moved through North Africa and into Italy. The Ostrogoths carved out kingdoms of their own. The Franks settled in Gaul, and the Angles and Saxons crossed the waters to claim new lands in what would one day be called England. These were not mere raids or isolated battles. Entire villages were uprooted. Trade routes that once carried olive oil, wine, and scrolls of ancient knowledge grew silent. Towns that had once been illuminated by flickering lamps and the voices of philosophers faded into ruins. Stone bridges crumbled, roads were left to weeds and weather, and with them the sense of a unified, interconnected world dimmed. It was a time of chaos, but not one of complete emptiness. Life, as it always does, adapted. Small local rulers claimed whatever pieces of land they could defend. Fortified towns emerged atop hills and behind thick wooden palisades. Old Roman buildings, once shining centers of learning or administration, were repurposed into fortresses or granaries. In some places, amphitheaters that had echoed with the cheers of thousands now sheltered livestock from the cold winds. For the ordinary people, the collapse of empire meant a narrowing of horizons. A farmer who might once have sold his harvest in a bustling market town found himself living within the shadow of a nearby lord's manor. His world reduced to the fields he tilled, and the church bell that marked the hours. Travel became dangerous. Roads that had once been patrolled by Roman soldiers were now frequented by bandits and desperate wanderers. News of distant events, which once spread across the empire on horseback or by ship, might now take months, even years, to reach isolated villages if it arrived at all. And yet, amidst the uncertainty, life persisted. The seasons turned. Crops were planted and harvested. Children were born beneath humble rooftops. Old songs were sung by flickering hearth fires. While the grand philosophies of Greece and Rome may have grown quiet, the stories of ancestors and gods, of spirits in the woods and heroes in battle, filled the night air. It was into this world, fragmented, fragile, and restless, that the church steadily stepped, while cities fell and roads decayed. Christian churches, once scattered and small, began to stand as symbols of something enduring. At first, they were modest, built from wood and stone, gathering places for worship and solace. But in a world where laws changed with each passing warlord and no king's crown stayed on his head for long, the church represented a kind of certainty. Its rituals remained constant. The words spoken in sacred Latin sounded the same, whether in a ruined Roman villa or a newly built chapel in the woods. Its beliefs offered not only hope for the afterlife, but a framework for understanding a world where so much seemed beyond human control. Monasteries soon followed, simple places where monks withdrew from the dangers of the world to pray, to work, and in time, to preserve what knowledge they could. In those early, shadowed centuries, these humble sanctuaries would become beacons of continuity, their candlelit halls quietly sheltering the fragile threads of history. And so the stage was set. A Europe no longer under the steady hand of Rome, but scattered, uncertain, and searching for new anchors. The question, softly whispered through these darkened landscapes, was no longer how to build empires, but how to endure. And in that quiet, in that delicate pause in the human story, something ancient faded, and something new and deeply intertwined with the church began to rise. Now, let's step a little closer. In those restless years following Rome's decline, as warlords fought over scraps of land and villages huddled behind makeshift walls, one institution quietly began to weave its way through the broken pieces of the old world: the Christian Church. Once a persecuted faith whispered about in the corners of ancient cities, had, by the dawn of this new era, transformed into something far greater, not merely a belief, but a structure, a pillar of stability rising amid the uncertainty. At first, it offered simple things: a place to gather, to pray, and to find comfort in the promise of something eternal when the present felt so fragile. A village might have no markets left, no stone walls or paved streets, but if it had a church, it had a center, a point around which daily life could orbit. In a time where kings came and went, and local rulers were often little more than armed strongmen, the church stood apart. Its leaders did not claim authority through the sword, but through sacred tradition and scripture. A bishop's staff might not gleam like a warlord's blade, but it held a different kind of power: the ability to name sins, to offer forgiveness, and to speak in the name of something far greater than any earthly crown. And so, slowly, people turned to the church not only for spiritual guidance but for leadership, protection, and justice as invasions raged, and the borders of old Roman provinces disappeared into the mists. Church figures began stepping into the roles once held by governors and magistrates. Bishops would settle disputes, arrange the distribution of food during famines, and negotiate peace between feuding lords. In many places, the church became the only institution capable of maintaining any kind of order. Monasteries, which had once been simple refuges of prayer, grew into centers of charity, hospitals for the sick, and storehouses for what little learning remained. Within their walls, monks tended to both the wounded and the written word, carefully copying ancient texts, even as the world beyond their gates seemed to forget them. It wasn't long before the church's reach extended beyond local villages and scattered abbeys. By the 6th and 7th centuries, popes in Rome began asserting influence over distant lands, sending envoys to kings and chieftains, offering blessings or condemning wars. Royalty sought the approval of bishops to legitimize their rule, for to hold power without the church's favor was to risk rebellion, not just of men, but of heaven itself. In this way, religion and politics became ever more entwined. Church councils shaped laws, declared certain practices heretical, and decided which beliefs would be permitted and which would be cast into shadow. Over time, its wealth grew. Lands were gifted to monasteries and cathedrals, tithes collected from peasants filled its coffers, and relics of saints drew pilgrims from every corner of Europe. For a world desperate for continuity, the church became both memory and hope, a living link to a past of emperors and apostles, and a promise of a future where salvation was still possible. Its power was subtle at first, woven through rituals and sacred words, but it was no less real than any sword or crown. And so, as darkness spread across former Roman lands, the church's light began to glow steadily brighter, offering structure in a world that had lost its way. Now, let's gently follow that light and see how it shaped not only hearts and prayers, but the very course of history itself. While kings and bishops shaped the fates of kingdoms and monasteries stood as quiet sanctuaries of learning, it was the ordinary people, the farmers, shepherds, artisans, and soldiers who bore the weight of daily life in those uncertain centuries. For most, existence was defined by the land. The rhythm of the year followed the turning of the seasons. In spring, fields were ploughed with heavy wooden tools, often drawn by oxen, and grain was sown with hopeful hands. Summer brought long days of tending to crops and animals, and when autumn arrived, there was the urgent task of harvesting before the first chill of winter crept into the air. Food was simple, often scarce, and rarely varied. Bread, made from whatever grains could be grown, formed the heart of every meal. Thick soups of vegetables and beans might accompany it, and on rare occasions, a bit of meat, perhaps a chicken or salted pork. Most peasants never tasted the spices or rich wines that once graced Roman tables. Shelter came in the form of small earthen homes with thatched roofs and packed dirt floors. A single room might house an entire family, along with their animals, huddled together for warmth when the cold winds blew. But it was not only the forces of nature they feared. Warfare was a constant threat. In the absence of a strong, central authority, local disputes easily turned violent. A neighboring lord might march armed men into nearby fields, claiming land or punishing imagined slights. Raiders, whether from rival tribes or distant shores, could descend without warning, setting fire to villages, taking what they pleased, and leaving ruin in their wake. For those who bore weapons, life was equally precarious. The sword or spear was as likely to bring death as it was protection. Battles were not the grand, chivalric affairs romanticized in later centuries, but brutal, desperate struggles, often fought over muddy fields or crumbling stone walls. And through it all, there was religion. In a world where tomorrow was uncertain, and misfortune seemed to strike without reason, faith became the steady thread that wove through every part of daily life. From birth to death, each moment was marked by religious custom. Newborns were baptized to protect their souls, marriages were blessed within the church's walls, and the dead were buried with whispered prayers for safe passage beyond this life. Holy days and festivals offered rare moments of respite. While most of the calendar was filled with labor, certain dates called for rest. For simple gatherings where villagers might sing old songs, share meager feasts, and listen to the words of a priest speaking of saints, miracles, and promises of eternal peace. The church bell marked the hours, calling the faithful to prayer at dawn, noon, and dusk. Its sound was both comfort and command, a reminder of the divine order that watched over even the smallest of lives in homes. Crude wooden crosses hung above hearths. In fields, men and women paused to murmur blessings before planting seeds or reaping grain. Illness, storms, and failed harvests were seen not as chance, but as signs of divine will, warnings, or punishments from a higher power. For the common folk of medieval Europe, life was neither grand nor easy. It was a quiet, often harsh struggle, softened only by faith, tradition, and the small, enduring comforts of family, song, and the land beneath their feet. And in the heart of it all, the church's presence was inescapable. Now, let's gently turn our gaze to the role that church would soon claim, not just as a companion to daily life, but as the very hand that guided it. Though much of the Roman Empire's grandeur crumbled beneath the weight of invasions and neglect, not every part of its legacy was lost to the darkened centuries. In the quiet spaces of monasteries and churches, sheltered behind thick stone walls, and far from the turmoil of warring lords, Fragments of ancient wisdom were carefully gathered and tended like flickering embers. The Church, perhaps more than any other institution of its time, took on the role of a custodian, a quiet keeper of the past. Roman texts on philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and rhetoric, once read aloud in marble halls, now survived in the careful hands of monks who worked by candlelight to copy them word by word onto parchment. Each stroke of ink was an act of preservation, a deliberate effort to hold on to what might otherwise vanish into memory. The Latin language itself, the tongue of Rome, was kept alive within the Church. Though it faded from the marketplaces and streets, it remained the language of scripture, of sermons, and of scholarly debate. It tied the present to the ancient world in ways both subtle and profound. Roman architectural techniques, too, found new life in Christian churches and monasteries. The rounded archways, stone columns, and mosaic floors, once favored by emperors and senators, were adapted to build sacred spaces meant to endure for centuries. Even the organization of the Church echoed the structure of the fallen empire, where once governors ruled provinces, bishops now tended to dioceses. Church councils resembled the old Roman senates, gathering to debate doctrine and issue decrees that would shape belief across kingdoms. It was not a perfect preservation. Much was lost, and what remained was often reshaped to fit the needs of faith. Yet, in preserving what fragments they could, the Church offered a fragile thread between antiquity and the world yet to come, a thread we shall follow, as it quietly wound its way through monasteries and candlelit chambers, keeping the memory of ancient Rome alive, even in the darkest of nights. As the long shadow of Rome faded, and new kingdoms rose from its scattered ruins, the Christian Church steadily grew from a quiet sanctuary of faith into the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. It did not seize power through armies or conquest in the way warlords claimed territories. Its influence crept in softly, woven through daily rituals, sacred words, and ancient tradition. At first, the Church was a unifying presence in a world torn apart by endless conflict. Across the vast stretch of lands once held together by Roman roads, different languages, customs, and rulers began to emerge. But amidst that growing patchwork of cultures, the Church offered something constant. No matter what kingdom a person found themselves in, no matter whose banner flew above the castle walls, the rituals of baptism, marriage, and last rites remained unchanged. The same prayers were whispered at dawn and dusk. The same scriptures were read from the same language, Latin, now spoken nowhere else but within church walls. This quiet consistency gave the Church a kind of authority no warlord could match. While kings ruled lands and armies, the Church claimed dominion over souls. And in an age when death was never far and life was filled with uncertainty, the promise of eternal peace carried a weight no earthly crown could equal. Over time, this spiritual authority naturally began to intertwine with political power. Local rulers, seeking to legitimize their rule, turned to bishops and abbots for blessings and support. To be crowned by the Church was to be acknowledged not just by men, but by heaven itself. And so, slowly, religious leaders gained a voice in the affairs of courts and councils. The Church's influence extended into the realm of education as well. With the collapse of Roman civic institutions, monasteries and cathedral schools became the primary centers of learning. Monks and priests were often the only people in a community who could read and write. It was within these sanctuaries that not only scriptures were studied, but the remnants of ancient philosophy, medicine, and history as well. Young men of noble Families were sent to monasteries to be educated, and from these sacred halls would emerge not only future priests, but counselors to kings and scribes for royal courts. The line between spiritual and temporal leadership blurred, as churchmen advised rulers, kept records, and even negotiated treaties. Culture, too, came increasingly under the church's watchful gaze. Art, once filled with the images of Roman gods and heroic legends, now centered on biblical stories and the lives of saints. Painters, sculptors, and musicians worked not for emperors, but for abbots and bishops. Creating works meant to glorify God and instruct the faithful. Even the calendar was shaped by the rhythms of the church. Holy days and saints' feasts marked the passage of time. The seasons were divided by periods of fasting and celebration, and important decisions were often delayed until after certain sacred festivals had passed. As its wealth grew through tithes, land donations, and the offerings of pilgrims, the church built magnificent cathedrals and monasteries. These structures, with their soaring stone towers and colored glass windows, dominated medieval towns. They were not merely places of worship, but symbols of the church's enduring presence and growing might. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the Pope, once a humble spiritual leader of Rome's Christian community, had become a figure of international importance. Popes wrote letters to kings, settled disputes between rival rulers, and even claimed the power to excommunicate monarchs, stripping them of both their spiritual authority and, by extension, their right to rule. One of the clearest moments of this authority came in the year 800, when Pope Leo III placed a crown upon the head of Charlemagne, declaring him Emperor of the Romans. In that single act, the Church claimed the right to make emperors, a power even mighty Rome itself had rarely granted to religious figures. From that moment onward, no ruler in Europe could ignore the influence of the Church. To fall out of its favor was to risk both earthly rebellion and eternal damnation. And so, without raising an army, without conquering a city by force, the Church consolidated power over politics, education, and culture, not through violence, but through ritual, belief, and the slow, steady pull of tradition. It became the axis around which medieval life turned, a presence felt in every decision, every festival, every whispered prayer before sleep. And in this growing influence, it would come to shape not only how people lived, but how they thought, how they learned, and how they imagined the world. Beyond their small villages, in the soft light of monasteries, and beneath the echoing stone vaults of cathedrals, history was being carefully guided, and some might later say, carefully restrained. But that is a story we shall gently unravel in the chapters ahead. As the Church's influence spread across medieval Europe, its leaders rose to positions of extraordinary authority, not only within the sacred walls of churches and monasteries, but in every corner of daily life. At the heart of this growing power stood the popes, the bishops of Rome, who claimed to be the successors of St. Peter, the apostles said to have been chosen by Christ himself. In a world where legitimacy and continuity mattered more than ever, this sacred lineage granted the papacy a unique and unshakable position. But the Pope's role was not confined to spiritual matters alone. In the absence of a strong, unifying empire, the Pope became an arbiter of kings and kingdoms. His blessing could lend divine legitimacy to a ruler's claim, or, if withdrawn, plunge entire realms into turmoil. Monarchs sought the Pope's favor, traveling long distances to kneel before him, to seek his counsel, or to ask for absolution. In times of crisis, it was not unusual for rulers to defer to the Pope on matters of war. marriage alliances, and succession disputes. A king excommunicated by the church might find himself isolated, his vassals questioning their loyalty, his people fearful for their immortal souls. One of the most famous examples of this power came in the late 11th century, when Pope Gregory VII excommunicated Emperor Henry IV during a fierce dispute over the appointment of bishops, an event that led to the emperor standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days outside the gates of Canossa, humbly seeking forgiveness. Yet, the Pope was not alone in wielding such influence. Throughout towns, villages, and courts, bishops and abbots oversaw the administration of both spiritual and worldly affairs. They acted as judges in matters of morality and law, resolving disputes over land, trade, and personal conduct. In many cases, their decisions carried more weight than those of local lords. Religious leaders held the power to declare fasts, to command days of mourning or celebration, and to grant or withhold the sacraments that marked the milestones of life, birth, marriage, and death. Beyond the formal structures of governance, the Church shaped the beliefs and daily practices of ordinary people. Priests delivered weekly sermons from simple wooden pulpits or beneath vaulted stone ceilings, offering guidance on everything from proper behavior in the marketplace to the dangers of envy, greed, and idle gossip. They warned of the torments awaiting the sinful and spoke of the joys promised to the faithful beyond this world, painting vivid pictures of both heaven and hell. Through these words, the Church offered both comfort and control, framing life's hardships as tests of faith and life's blessings as signs of divine favor. Religious leaders also guided education and learning. As monasteries became the primary centers of knowledge, abbots and scholars decided which texts would be copied, studied, and taught. Certain works of classical philosophy and science were preserved, while others, particularly those viewed as heretical or dangerous, were left to fade into obscurity. In doing so, the Church did not merely safeguard knowledge. It curated it, deciding what ideas would pass from one generation to the next. The worldview taught within monastery walls and from cathedral pulpits placed God at the center of all things, with humanity's purpose defined by its relationship to the divine. Even matters of health and medicine fell under the Church's gaze. Monasteries often served as infirmaries, where monks tended to the sick with herbal remedies, prayers, and rituals. Illness was seen not only as a physical ailment but as a spiritual trial, and care of the body was closely tied to care of the soul. Religious festivals and holy days punctuated the calendar, setting the rhythm for work, rest, and celebration. The year was measured by sacred time, Lent and Easter, Advent and Christmas, the feast days of saints and solemn commemorations of the dead. In every aspect of medieval life, from the fields to the castle halls, from birth to burial, the Church's presence was unmistakable, and at the summit of this vast interconnected system of faith and authority stood the Pope, with his bishops and abbots spread across Europe like a network of watchful shepherds. Together, they oversaw not only the souls of the faithful, but the very fabric of society itself. Their decisions shaped kingdoms, their words swayed armies, and their quiet presence in every village and town reminded the people of something larger than themselves, an invisible order that connected the smallest peasant to the greatest king, and bound every life to the eternal. As night fell and the church bells echoed across the darkened countryside, it was the voice of the Church that whispered through the silence, guiding hearts and history alike. And so, the world moved, softly beneath its careful gaze. As the church's presence spread through the courts of kings and the fields of farmers, it also took hold of something far subtler, yet perhaps even more enduring, the shaping of the mind, in a world where written knowledge was scarce and literacy rare. Control over education and the written word meant control over how people understood the world and how they imagined their place within it. With the collapse of Roman civic institutions, the monasteries and cathedral schools of the church became the sole guardians of learning. Within their stone walls, monks and priests devoted their days to the careful copying of texts. By the flicker of candlelight and in the hush of cloistered scriptoriums, they transcribed sacred scriptures, theological treatises, and selected works from antiquity. But it was the church that decided what was worthy of preservation. Certain texts, those that aligned with Christian doctrine or could be interpreted through a theological lens, were painstakingly copied and passed from generation to generation. The philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, for example, survived not in the bustling libraries of ancient cities, but in the care of devout scribes who sought in their words traces of divine wisdom. Other works, however, were allowed to fade into the silence of forgotten shelves. Texts that questioned religious authority or celebrated the old pagan gods were rarely copied. Scientific treatises that conflicted with the church's understanding of the cosmos might be set aside. In this way, knowledge was not extinguished outright, but curated, shaped into a narrative that served both faith and order. Education itself was reserved for a select few. The vast majority of medieval people could neither read nor write. For peasants and laborers, the rhythms of life were learned by watching the land and listening to the words of the village priest. Only the sons of noble families, and those destined for religious life, were granted the rare privilege of formal education within monastery schools and cathedral classrooms. Young novices were taught Latin, the language of scripture and scholarship, alongside the teachings of the church. Lessons in grammar, rhetoric, and logic prepared them not for worldly debate, but for the careful study of sacred texts. Even the concept of history was shaped within these hallowed walls. Chronicles of kings and battles were written by monks who viewed the rise and fall of empires as part of a divine plan. Events were recorded not merely as facts, but as moral lessons, reminders of God's justice, mercy, and wrath. And it wasn't only words. The church sought to shape the arts, too, fell under its steady gaze. Paintings, sculptures, music, and drama were no longer created to entertain or to glorify mortal heroes, as they had in ancient times. Instead, they became tools for spiritual instruction and reflection, in village churches and grand cathedrals alike. Walls were adorned with frescoes and mosaics depicting biblical scenes and the lives of saints. To a largely illiterate population, these images spoke louder than words, offering vivid reminders of sin, salvation, and the mysteries of the afterlife. Artists worked not for personal fame, but for the glory of God. Their creations were meant to inspire humility, awe, and devotion. A carving of Christ upon the cross, a painting of the Virgin's gentle face, a stained glass window aglow with colored light, all served to remind the faithful of their place within a divine order. Music, too, was shaped by the church's hand. The ancient songs of Rome were replaced by hymns and chants composed to accompany the liturgy. Gregorian chant, with its slow, meditative tones, became the voice of sacred space, its notes rising and falling like soft waves in a quiet sea. Even theatre, once a boisterous celebration of human folly and heroism, was transformed. Morality plays and mystery dramas replaced the old tales of gods and warriors, acting out biblical stories for gathered crowds. Through these performances, the Church conveyed lessons of virtue, warning of sin, and offering glimpses of grace. In every form of expression, the written word, the painted wall, the sung prayer, the Church left its imprint. It guided not only what people believed, but how they spoke, sang, and created. Its careful stewardship of culture ensured that even in the most turbulent times, a thread of tradition and meaning would endure. And so, as the centuries passed, the Church's influence over education, literature, and the arts did not merely preserve the past, it reshaped it. It built a world where knowledge and beauty alike pointed heavenward, where every book and song and carved stone carried a message of faith. A world where the sacred and the learned were forever intertwined, and, in the chapters ahead, we'll quietly explore what became of those ancient ideas that did not fit so easily within that sacred frame. As the Roman Empire crumbled and its borders faded into memory, the vast wealth of knowledge it had once gathered teetered on the brink of vanishing. In the grand libraries of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, the wisdom of centuries had been carefully collected, scrolls filled with philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics, penned by Greek and Roman scholars whose names still echo faintly through the corridors of history. But when the world grew dark and restless, those safe havens of learning became vulnerable. One by one, the libraries that had preserved the thoughts of antiquity were lost. Some fell to invading armies, their walls shattered and their shelves consumed by fire. Others were abandoned, left to decay as the scholars who tended them fled or perished. Scrolls that had survived for generations were destroyed not by malice alone, but by the slow, inevitable work of time and neglect. The most famous of these losses, though it occurred centuries before the Middle Ages fully dawned, was the Great Library of Alexandria, a place said to have housed hundreds of thousands of texts from across the known world. It was reduced to ashes in a series of calamities, wars, riots, and decrees that left little behind but whispered legends. Though long gone, its destruction symbolized what so much of the ancient world would soon endure. In the West, as Roman cities emptied and roads fell to ruin, the care of books and written knowledge passed to the Church, but the vast scope of classical learning, which had once included treatises on the workings of the natural world, human anatomy, and the distant stars, was narrowed. The emphasis shifted toward theology, scripture, and commentaries on sacred texts, texts that spoke of a universe governed by natural laws rather than divine will, or that explored ideas seen as incompatible with Christian doctrine, were often deemed unnecessary or worse, dangerous. Some were quietly set aside, copied only rarely. Others were lost entirely, their fragile pages crumbling in unused libraries, their language slipping into obscurity. The practical sciences suffered greatly. Knowledge of complex engineering, medicine, and astronomy withered. The intricate aqueduct systems that once carried water to Roman cities fell into disrepair, their designs forgotten. Surgical techniques known to Galen and Hippocrates faded from use, replaced by herbal remedies and prayers. Even the measurement of time, once carefully charted by Roman engineers and astronomers, became a challenge. With the collapse of centralized authority and the disuse of roads and communication, local communities came to rely not on precise calendars but on the toll of church bells and the observation of the seasons. And yet, not all knowledge vanished. At once, in certain corners of Europe, Isolated monasteries clung to fragments of the old world. Monks in remote scriptoria painstakingly copied what books they could find, preserving a slender thread of classical wisdom alongside sacred texts. A handful of ancient authors, Pliny, Aristotle, Cicero's, survived through these efforts, though often read through a theological lens. But many works were lost beyond recovery. Entire volumes of ancient plays, histories, and scientific observations disappeared. The writings of thinkers whose ideas challenged or questioned prevailing religious views rarely made it through the long centuries intact. In the East, the Byzantine Empire fared better. There, in the libraries of Constantinople and the schools of scholars like John Philoponus, much of Greek learning endured, and far to the south and east, in the Islamic world, great centers of learning rose in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, where classical texts were translated, studied, and expanded upon. But in much of Western Europe, what remained of classical science and philosophy survived in silenced, hidden away, half understood, and seldom taught beyond the walls of monasteries. It is easy to imagine those quiet, candlelit rooms, a lone monk hunched over an ancient manuscript, tracing faded letters with careful hands. Outside, the world moved on, fields tilled, battles fought, kingdoms born and broken. But within those walls, a fragile connection to the ancient past flickered. This gradual disappearance of classical knowledge was not always the result of deliberate suppression. More often, it was the natural consequence of instability. Wars destroyed cities where libraries once stood. Generations of famine and plague left fewer to carry on scholarly traditions, and the relentless pull of survival narrowed human focus to the immediate and the practical. Even so, the loss was profound. It would be centuries before much of this forgotten wisdom returned to Europe, carried back through translations of Arabic texts, the fall of Constantinople, and the resurgence of learning in the Renaissance. In those long, dark centuries, human curiosity never fully vanished, but it was dimmed, softened to a quiet ember, waiting for the right conditions to flare once more. And so, in the next chapter of our gentle journey, we'll follow the thread of those few brave souls who kept the lamp of knowledge burning, often in secret, guided by faith, curiosity, and an unyielding hope that wisdom, like the dawn, would one day return. As the old libraries of Rome and Alexandria crumbled into dust, and as classical knowledge slowly faded from the memory of most, the task of preserving what remained fell into fewer and fewer hands. And among those, none held greater power or greater control than the Church. In a time when parchment was precious, and literacy a rare and guarded skill, the simple act of writing became sacred. The copying of texts, once carried out by state-sponsored scribes or independent scholars, now passed almost entirely into the hands of monks and clerics, working behind monastery walls, far from the noise of cities and the struggles of kings within these monasteries. In scriptoriums lit by narrow windows and flickering oil lamps, rows of devoted scribes bent over desks. They copied not only the Bible, but also selected works of Roman philosophy, natural history, and medicine, yet always through the lens of faith. Each page was painstakingly reproduced by hand, every word an act of reverence. Illuminated initials glowed with gold leaf. Margins carried careful illustrations of vines, animals, or sometimes quiet symbols of devotion. These manuscripts were works of art, but they were also powerful tools, and, more importantly, they were rare, because the Church controlled the copying of texts. It also decided which ones were worth copying at all. And so, slowly, the vast diversity of ancient thought was narrowed. Texts that aligned with Christian teachings or could be adapted to support theological reflection were preserved. Others, those deemed pagan, skeptical, or too curious about the workings of the natural world, were often neglected, or even deliberately suppressed. The great treatises of Epicurus, for instance, which denied divine influence in nature, disappeared from circulation. Many early medical and astronomical texts were allowed to fade, their contents seen as either irrelevant to salvation or potentially dangerous to the faith of readers. This was not done with malice, nor always with intention. Often it was simply a matter of choice, of space, of time, and of what was seen as spiritually beneficial. But over generations, these choices had a profound effect. What was not copied was forgotten. The libraries that did exist, often kept within monasteries or cathedral schools, were closely guarded. Access to these collections was limited to those within the church or those studying for the priesthood. Lay people, even nobles, were often excluded unless they were donors or patrons of significant influence. In this way, knowledge itself became a kind of sacred possession. It was not meant to be questioned, shared freely, or interpreted in personal ways. It was to be received reverently from the hands of the church and used only in service of faith. Even teaching was shaped by this monopoly. The few schools that remained open were almost entirely run by the church. Their education revolved around religious texts and doctrine. Grammar and rhetoric were taught to aid in preaching. Logic was useful for theological debate. Astronomy was studied only insofar as it helped calculate the date of Easter. Curiosity, that restless desire to ask why and how, was gently discouraged, unless it stayed within approved boundaries. To question too deeply, or to seek explanations that did not point toward God, was to walk a dangerous path. And yet, for all this restriction, these monastic centers also preserved treasures. Without the church's scribes, we might have no Virgil, no Cicero, no remnants of Hippocrates or Aristotle. The survival of classical thought, even in fragments, is due in part to the monks who, for reasons of faith and reverence, chose to preserve them, sometimes without fully understanding their content. But the key, always, was control. Knowledge flowed through the church like water through a narrow stream. It might quench the thirst of those nearby, but it never flooded the fields. It was kept contained, measured, and sacred in the centuries to come. This careful gatekeeping would be both praised and questioned. Some would see it as a noble effort to protect truth in a fragile world. Others would call it a dam holding back the tides of progress for far too long. But in those early, uncertain centuries, the church stood alone as the guardian of knowledge, and its quiet monopoly over copying, storing, and sharing the written word shaped the course of learning for generations. And now, as night deepens, let us quietly imagine a monk in a distant abbey, leaning over a page of ancient text, ink-stained fingers steady, heart devout. His candle flickers, casting gold against the vellum. Somewhere in that moment between silence and script, the memory of a forgotten world is held for just a little longer. As the church's role as custodian of knowledge deepened, so too did its cautious watch over the ideas that circulated through the fragile, flickering world of medieval learning. For while many texts from the ancient world were preserved within monastery walls, not every idea was welcomed. Some, particularly those that questioned the divine order or proposed explanations for the natural world independent of religious teaching, were quietly discouraged or, more directly, suppressed. It was a world where mystery was sacred, where illness was often seen as a punishment for sin, and the movement of the stars a reflection of God's will. In such a world, the very act of asking why, and especially how, could be dangerous. The Church's doctrine placed God at the center of all creation. Every occurrence, from the fall of a leaf to the sweep of a plague, was part of a divine plan. To suggest that natural forces, gravity, anatomy, or the invisible workings of the stars, might move according to their own laws, was, in many cases, to question God's sovereignty itself. And so, certain ideas from classical antiquity, though known, were treated with suspicion. Early understandings of physics, astronomy, and medicine sometimes conflicted with the Church's view of a universe ordered around divine purpose. The heliocentric theory, the idea that the Earth moved around the Sun, was one such example, even though it would not gain real prominence until centuries later with Copernicus and Galileo. Earlier hints of this idea, mentioned by ancient Greek thinkers like Aristarchus, were dismissed or quietly buried, as they contradicted the established geocentric model which placed Earth immobile at the center of the universe. The geocentric model was not just a scientific theory, it was woven into theology. The heavens turned around the Earth because humanity, created in God's image, occupied the heart of creation. To suggest otherwise was to risk unraveling not only a model of the cosmos but the religious narrative that gave medieval life its meaning. Medicine, too, was confined within sacred boundaries. Ancient practices of anatomical study were largely abandoned. Dissection of the human body was discouraged, sometimes prohibited outright, as the body was seen as a sacred vessel, its mysteries known only to God. As a result, much of what classical physicians like Galen had learned through direct observation was replaced with guesswork and prayer. When illness struck, its cause was often attributed to spiritual imbalance or divine punishment. Monks and physicians might prescribe herbal remedies, but these were accompanied by prayers, relics, and rituals. To inquire too deeply into physical causes alone was to risk charges of impiety. Even philosophical inquiry, the pursuit of reason for its own sake, was approached with caution. The works of ancient philosophers, such as Plato and Aristotle, though preserved by monks, were often read selectively. Passages that could be harmonized with Christian theology were copied and taught, while those promoting skeptical inquiry, questioning the soul's immortality, or suggesting the eternity of the universe were censored, debated, or dismissed. Ideas that emphasized human reason above divine revelation unsettled many church authorities. The belief that human beings might, through observation and logic alone, unlock the secrets of nature posed a quiet but persistent threat to a worldview in which all truth was believed to flow from God's word and the Church's interpretation. From time to time, this tension flared into open conflict. Scholars accused of heresy faced harsh consequences, though the medieval Church was often more tolerant than later stereotypes suggest. Thinkers whose ideas directly challenged core doctrines risked censure, imprisonment, or worse. Even whispered doubts about miracles, the afterlife, or the nature of God's creation could place a scholar in grave danger. The later, more famous cases, such as those of Galileo and Giordano Bruno, belong to the Renaissance and early modern period, yet their roots stretch deep into the medieval centuries, where a quiet, careful boundary was drawn between permitted inquiry and forbidden speculation. And yet, it would be unfair to imagine this as a reign of unbroken oppression. Many within The church were themselves curious and thoughtful men. Monastic libraries housed works of ancient science alongside scripture. In cathedral schools, debates about logic, ethics, and the natural world were common, so long as they remained within the safe walls of orthodoxy. The challenge was never curiosity itself, but the direction in which it pointed. Knowledge was encouraged if it illuminated God's greatness, if it strengthened faith, if it reinforced the sacred order of the world. It was resisted if it threatened to loosen that order, to suggest a universe in which the divine was not always visible in every storm, every illness, every movement of the heavens. And so, science in the medieval world existed, but like a flame, protected by careful hands. It flickered in the monasteries, it glimmered in the guarded writings of scholars, and it waited, sometimes centuries, for safer days to burn brighter as we drift onward through this quiet chapter of history. We'll gently meet those rare, resilient minds who kept that fragile light alive. Yet even in those long centuries, when inquiry was carefully contained and the scope of acceptable knowledge tightly drawn, there remained gentle, stubborn minds who quietly refused to let the flicker of ancient wisdom die. In corners of monasteries, behind thick stone walls, there were those who read the old texts not only with reverence, but with curiosity. They asked questions in hushed tones, pondered forbidden ideas by candlelight, and recorded their thoughts in margins of manuscripts no one else would see. Among these quiet figures, one of the most remarkable was the Venerable Bede. Born in the 7th century in the north of England, Bede spent his life in a remote monastery at Jarrow, a place far removed from the courts of kings and the bustle of cities. And yet, within those simple stone walls, Bede devoted himself to a lifetime of study. Though deeply devout, Bede believed that understanding the natural world was a way of honoring its creator. He wrote not only about theology, but also about the seasons, astronomy, and medicine. His work De Natura Rerum compiled knowledge about the movement of the sun and moon, eclipses, and the tides, observations drawn both from ancient Roman texts and from his own careful watching of the world. Bede's most famous work, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, is often remembered as a religious chronicle, yet it also reflects a spirit of inquiry rare for its time. He preserved ancient stories, recorded weather patterns, and noted unusual events with the mind of both a monk and a natural philosopher. His writings were cautious, always framed within the teachings of the Church, but between the lines, one can sense a restless curiosity, a desire to understand how the heavens moved and how nature worked, even as he clothed those mysteries in sacred language. Another figure, equally gentle yet no less determined, was Boethius, living a century before Bede. In the fading light of the late Roman world, Boethius served as a philosopher, statesman, and translator. His greatest work, The Consolation of Philosophy, was written while he was imprisoned, awaiting execution for charges of treason. In those final, uncertain days, Boethius turned not to prayers alone, but to reason. He conversed on the nature of fate, free will, and the human condition, not in defiance of God, but in search of meaning amid suffering. His work drew upon the philosophies of Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, preserving their ideas in language palatable to medieval theologians. While much ancient philosophy was left untranslated or suppressed, Boethius's writings quietly bridged the gap between the classical and Christian worlds. Through his translations of Aristotle's logical works, Boethius reintroduced tools of reasoning that would, centuries later, ignite the intellectual revival of medieval Europe. Yet in his own time, his influence spread softly, passed from monastery to monastery, read by candlelight, and quoted in sermons. These men were not rebels. In the modern sense, they did not denounce the Church or seek to overturn its teachings. Instead, they worked within the narrow space permitted to them, quietly preserving fragments of ancient thought and gently asking the questions that might have otherwise been lost. Their resilience lay in patience. They knew that great ideas did not need to blaze to endure, that a single copied manuscript, a careful footnote, a passing mention in a homily, could carry a thought across centuries. And so, in the silent hours of the night, as bells marked the passage of sacred time, these scholars wrote. In monasteries battered by winter winds, in scriptoriums thick with the scent of ink and old parchment, they kept their fragile inheritance alive. It was a fragile, flickering light in the darkness, but it endured, and because it did, when the long sleep of medieval Europe began to lift, there would be ancient voices waiting to be heard again in the chapters to come. We'll gently follow how those threads of quiet resilience were gathered, woven, and slowly brought back into the daylight of new curiosity. As we journey deeper into the quiet corridors of history, it becomes clear that the story of the Church's influence over human progress is neither simple nor one-sided. It is a story woven with both shadows and light, of moments where wisdom was preserved with care, and others where inquiry was restrained to begin. Let us gently consider the generous side of this long tale. For while the medieval Church is often remembered for the ideas it suppressed, it is also true that it served as the primary guardian of knowledge through centuries when war, famine, and invasion threatened to sweep away the remnants of the ancient world. When the great libraries of Alexandria, Rome, and Antioch fell, it was in the quiet, disciplined hands of monks that the written word found refuge. In monasteries scattered across Europe, from the misty shores of Ireland to the sun-drenched hills of Italy, sacred texts and select works of ancient philosophy, medicine, and natural science were copied and preserved. This was no small task. In an age before the printing press, every book was a labor of weeks or months, sometimes even years. Parchment was costly, ink carefully mixed, and trained scribes were few. Each manuscript copied by a monastic hand was a small act of defiance against the chaos beyond the cloister walls. And though their choices of thought to preserve were guided by religious devotion, it was because of these monks that fragments of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Galen survived it all. It's also important to remember that medieval scholars believed knowledge itself to be a gift from God. The act of studying the stars, the seasons, the workings of the human body, and the philosophies of earlier times was, for them, a way of better understanding the Creator's design. Through this reverence for knowledge, however cautious, the Church maintained a fragile thread connecting the intellectual traditions of antiquity to the world that would one day awaken in the Renaissance. Consider, too, how the Church preserved cultural and artistic traditions. Medieval cathedrals, with their soaring arches and luminous stained glass, were more than places of worship. They were repositories of craft, architecture, and artistic expression that might otherwise have been lost. The music of Gregorian chant carried echoes of ancient melodic systems. Even as it shaped new forms of sacred sound, the Church was also instrumental in safeguarding languages. While many local dialects evolved and faded Latin, the language of Rome survived in the liturgy and learning of the Church. This continuity allowed for ideas, texts, and histories to be shared across distant lands and generations. Festivals and holy days maintained the rhythm of the year, offering communities moments of rest, celebration, and reflection. Through these rites and rituals, older traditions were often absorbed into Christian practice, preserving ancient seasonal customs within a sacred framework. Even moral and philosophical inquiry found shelter within the church's walls, though speculative thinking was constrained by orthodoxy. Monasteries and cathedral schools became centers of debate and contemplation. Questions of ethics, virtue, and the nature of the soul were pondered by theologians who, though guided by Scripture, drew upon the works of earlier thinkers. Scholars like Anselm of Canterbury and Thomas Aquinas would, in later centuries, merge Christian theology with the reasoning of Aristotle, an intellectual tradition known as scholasticism. It sought to demonstrate that faith and reason, rather than being enemies, could illuminate one another in this careful dance between reverence and curiosity. The Church provided a structure in which learning, though limited, could endure. It is also worth noting that many church leaders, far from being oppressors of knowledge, were themselves deeply learned men. Popes, bishops, and abbots collected books, commissioned translations, and supported schools. The famed monastic libraries of Cluny, Monte Cassino, and Canterbury became havens for scholars, offering access to texts that might otherwise have vanished. While access was often restricted, it was through the slow, steady efforts of these religious institutions that the foundations of Europe's intellectual revival were laid. Had the Church not preserved even fragments of ancient thought, the world might have faced a far deeper intellectual darkness. So, in this light, soft and steady, the Church appears as a guardian, a cautious, sometimes hesitant protector of wisdom, whose decisions, though imperfect, allowed some sparks of ancient learning to survive the winds of time. And as we hold this perspective in our minds, it reminds us that history is seldom shaped by villains or heroes alone. The medieval Church, like all great institutions, was made up of human beings, fearful, faithful, ambitious, and wise. In moments of danger, they chose to shelter what they could. In times of uncertainty, they erred on the side of caution, and in doing so, they preserved not only sacred scripture, but the fading voices of the ancient world. In the chapters that follow, we'll gently turn to the other side of this long and intricate debate, to the places where curiosity was discouraged, where inquiry was restrained, and where certain ideas were quietly allowed to disappear. But for now, let us pause here, in the dim light of a monastery library, where a patient scribe bends over a faded text, and imagine the steady scratch of his pen as he carries the thoughts of long-dead philosophers into the uncertain future. A small, steady act of preservation in a world forever balanced between forgetting and remembering. And in that fragile balance, history waits. And yet, as with all human stories, there is another side to this quiet narrative. For while the Church preserved ancient knowledge within its monasteries and safeguarded fragile texts through troubled centuries, it also imposed boundaries around what could be questioned, what could be taught, and what could be believed. If the medieval Church was a guardian of learning, it was a cautious one, often fearful of the new, wary of dissent, and determined to protect its vision of order in a world it believed to be precariously balanced between divine grace and human sin. New ideas, particularly those that seemed to challenge the Church's understanding of the cosmos, the human body, or the soul's place in the universe, were often met with suspicion. Inquiry was permitted only within carefully drawn lines, and those who stepped beyond them risked more than censure. In some cases, they risked their freedom, and in rare but fateful moments, their lives. Throughout the medieval centuries, numerous ideas that might have advanced human understanding were quietly discouraged or outright censored. Texts that proposed alternative explanations of nature, ideas about the movement of the planets, the causes of disease, or the nature of matter were often deemed dangerous. This was not mere stubbornness. The Church's worldview rested on a delicate theological framework in which every aspect of creation reflected divine will. To suggest that the earth might move around the sun, or that illness might arise from natural causes rather than spiritual failing, was to risk unraveling the carefully woven cloth of medieval belief. Even modest proposals for reform or new ways of understanding theology itself were viewed with apprehension. The writings of early medieval thinkers who delved too deeply into speculative philosophy were sometimes banned or suppressed. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, though formally established much later, was preceded by centuries of quiet censorship. Manuscripts deemed heretical disappeared from monastery shelves. Debates were ended, scholars silenced, and it was not only ideas about the natural world that faced resistance. Religious dissent, different interpretations of Scripture, alternative visions of salvation, or challenges to the Church's authority was treated as an existential threat. Movements like the Cathars in southern France or the Waldensians in the Alps, who proposed simpler, less hierarchical forms of Christianity, were ruthlessly suppressed. Their teachings were branded heresy, their followers excommunicated, persecuted, or executed. In this way, the medieval Church acted as a gatekeeper, allowing certain ideas to pass while barring others, not always for reasons of theology alone, but also for the maintenance of power. For knowledge, in any age, carries within it the power to reshape societies. To suggest that kings ruled by human strength rather than divine favor, or that the natural world moved according to laws that might one day be understood by human reason, threatened not just doctrine, but authority. It is worth remembering that while monks preserved ancient texts, they also determined which passages to copy and which to leave behind. Subtle acts of omission, cautious edits, and the selective preservation of certain works over others shaped the intellectual inheritance of medieval Europe. For every manuscript of Aristotle's logic that survived, many others' works on natural sciences, ethics, or political thought were neglected. The loss was not always deliberate, but it was often shaped by fear of heresy, fear of social unrest, and fear of knowledge unbound by faith. Even within the Church, those who questioned too boldly faced consequences. The case of Peter Abelard, a brilliant 12th century philosopher and theologian, offers a poignant example. Abelard dared to apply rigorous logic to theology, raising uncomfortable questions about church doctrine. Though he remained a Christian believer, his insistence on intellectual freedom led to condemnation, forced exile, and the burning of his writings, and so it was for many like him. The suppression of ideas was rarely dramatic. It did not always come in the form of trials or executions. More often, it came in quieter ways. A refusal to copy a book, a scholar denied a pulpit, a monastery discouraged from teaching certain texts. These small, persistent acts of control gradually narrowed the intellectual landscape of medieval Europe. Medicine, once a field of empirical observation in the ancient world, retreated into repetition of old texts with little innovation. Astronomy was reduced to calculations for religious festivals, Natural philosophy remained bound to theology, its purpose not to explain nature for its own sake, but to reveal the workings of God. The cost of this intellectual caution was not immediate, but over centuries it slowed the pace of discovery. Ideas that might have reshaped medicine, science, or philosophy were delayed, sometimes by generations. It would not be until the late medieval and early Renaissance periods that this grip would loosen, when scholars, many still within the Church but emboldened by newly recovered Greek and Arabic texts, would quietly begin to question again. And so, as we weigh this side of the story, the Church appears not as a villain, but as a deeply human institution, one that guarded precious knowledge while fearing its consequences. A force of order in a fragile world, yet also a source of hesitation when boldness might have served better. History rarely offers us simple judgments, and as we lie here in the gentle hush of evening, it's worth remembering that both caution and curiosity have their places in human affairs. That sometimes fear of the unknown slows progress, and that at other times restraint protects what might otherwise be lost. In the coming moments, we'll softly reflect on some of the most famous and tragic examples of what happens when new ideas meet old fears. But for now, let us rest in the delicate balance of this long and intricate debate, for in the quiet spaces between preservation and suppression, history whispers its most enduring lessons. As we gently move forward through the centuries, the tension between faith and inquiry becomes more visible, sometimes painfully so. Two figures stand out as symbols of this delicate dance: Giordano Bruno, a thinker ahead of his time, and Galileo Galilei, whose discoveries would echo through the ages. Giordano Bruno lived in the late 16th century, a man whose vision of the cosmos reached far beyond what many could imagine. He proposed an infinite universe, filled with countless worlds, and suggested that the sun was but one star among many. These ideas challenged the traditional, church-endorsed view of a finite, earth-centered universe. Bruno's thinking was bold, but it was also controversial. He embraced not only new astronomy, but also philosophical and theological ideas that unsettled church authorities. His beliefs included elements of pantheism, and he questioned core Christian doctrines in ways that made him dangerous in the eyes of religious leaders. Despite his deep passion for knowledge and exploration, Bruno's life ended tragically. Accused of heresy, he was imprisoned for years and ultimately burned at the stake in Rome in 1600. His story remains a somber reminder of the cost of challenging established authority in a world where faith and power were tightly intertwined. A few decades later, Galileo Galilei would face a similar struggle. Galileo's telescopic observations confirmed that the Earth was not the center of the universe. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, phases of Venus, and mountains on the moon itself, all evidence supporting the Copernican heliocentric model. Yet his discoveries were met with suspicion and hostility by the Church. In 1633, Galileo was tried by the Inquisition, forced to recant his support for heliocentrism. He spent the remainder of his life under house arrest. Though he continued his scientific work in private, the Church's condemnation cast a long shadow. Both Bruno and Galileo exemplify the profound complexities of this historical period, where the thirst for knowledge met with the boundaries of religious doctrine and institutional power. Their stories are often told as conflicts between science and religion, but gently reflecting on them, we can see a more nuanced picture. They lived in times when the lines between theology, philosophy, and science were not sharply drawn. Both were deeply religious men, seeking understanding of God's creation through different paths. Their struggles reveal the challenges of navigating faith and reason in a world not yet ready to separate the two. And as we contemplate their legacies, let us remember not only the hardships they endured, but also the light they helped bring into the unfolding story of human progress. In this quiet reflection, their courage and curiosity softly remind us that even in times of constraint, the human spirit seeks to explore, to question, and to dream beyond the horizons before it. As we softly close this chapter of our journey, it is important to pause and hold a gentle space for reflection. History, after all, is rarely a story of simple heroes or villains. It is a tapestry woven from countless threads, some bright, some dark, each contributing to the complex picture of human experience. The Church of the Dark Ages was not merely an oppressor, nor solely a guardian. It was a human institution, shaped by its time, its fears, and its hopes. Its leaders and scholars acted with devotion, conviction, and sometimes with caution born from uncertainty. In preserving ancient knowledge, they offered a precious gift to future generations. In resisting new ideas, they sought to protect a world they believed was fragile and sacred, rather than rushing to judgment. Let us gently acknowledge the delicate balance they held between faith and inquiry, tradition and change. In the quiet moments of contemplation, we can see their struggle not as failure, but as part of the ongoing human quest to understand our place in the universe. And perhaps it is in this very tension between holding on and letting go that progress truly finds its rhythm. So, as you drift deeper into rest, carry with you the thought that history teaches us patience and humility. For every light that flickers in the dark, there is a story of perseverance. And in the long night of the past, those quiet, careful hands preserved not only knowledge, but the hope of tomorrow. As we continue our gentle journey through the centuries of the Dark Ages, let us pause to meet some of the remarkable minds who quietly illuminated this often misunderstood era. These were scholars whose devotion to learning, to the sacred texts, and to the ancient wisdom helped preserve and sometimes even expand the fragile flame of knowledge amid the surrounding darkness. One such figure was Isidore of Seville. Living in the late 6th and early 7th centuries, Isidore was a bishop in the city of Seville, in what is now Spain. At a time when Europe was fragmented and many ancient libraries had been lost, Isidore devoted himself to compiling and preserving knowledge for future generations. His most famous work, the Etymologia, was an ambitious attempt to collect the wisdom of the classical world, covering topics as varied as grammar, medicine, astronomy, theology, and history. This encyclopedia, written in a time when books were rare and education limited, became a foundational text for medieval scholars. Through it, countless bits of knowledge survived that might have otherwise vanished. What made Isidore's work so valuable was not only its breadth, but its accessibility. He wrote with the hope that monks, priests, and rulers alike might find guidance in his pages, carrying forward the knowledge of the past into the uncertain present. Moving northward to the kingdom of the Franks, another figure stands out. Alcuin of York, born around 735 in northern England, Alcuin was a learned monk whose reputation as a scholar spread far beyond his homeland. Invited by Charlemagne, the great Frankish king, to serve as a leading advisor and educator at his court, Alcuin played a pivotal role in what we now call the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning and culture that shaped medieval Europe. Alcuin's work centered on education. He helped establish schools, revised religious texts, and promoted the study of Latin, grammar, and rhetoric. Under his guidance, monks and clerics were trained not only in theology but also in the liberal arts, the very foundation of intellectual life in the Middle Ages. His efforts ensured that ancient manuscripts were copied carefully, that learning was valued as a sacred task, and that the Church could once again become a beacon of knowledge and culture. Alcuin's influence reached far and wide. He corresponded with scholars and rulers across Europe, encouraging the pursuit of wisdom even amid political turmoil. Other monastic scholars also made important contributions, often working in relative obscurity, but with equal dedication. Take the example of Cassiodorus, a Roman statesman who, after retiring from public life in the 6th century, founded the monastery of Vivarium in southern Italy. There, he created one of the earliest attempts at a monastic library and scriptorium, a place where monks could read, copy, and study manuscripts. Cassiodorus saw this work as essential to preserving the knowledge of the Roman world and passing it on to the future. In the British Isles, the monastic schools of Iona, Lindisfarne, and Wearmouth Jarrow became centres of learning and manuscript production. It was in these remote monasteries that scholars not only copied ancient texts, but also created beautiful illuminated manuscripts, works of art that combined spiritual devotion with careful scholarship. One such scholar was the Venerable Bede, whom we met earlier. His lifelong dedication to history and science exemplifies the quiet perseverance of these monastic intellectuals. Beyond preservation, some monks ventured to expand knowledge in fields such as astronomy and medicine. They observed the stars too, determined the timing of religious festivals, and studied herbal remedies to care for the sick in their communities. These endeavors were not simply academic exercises. They were acts of faith. In seeking to understand the world, these scholars sought to honor the Creator, believing that every discovery was a glimpse into the divine order. Their work was often solitary and painstaking, carried out by candlelight, in cold stone rooms, yet their impact was profound. The manuscripts they copied would be the foundation for the universities that blossomed centuries later. Their devotion laid the groundwork for the gradual rediscovery of classical thought and the eventual flowering of the Renaissance. In this way, the monastic scholars of the Dark Ages were both guardians and pioneers, holding fast to the wisdom of the past while planting seeds for future growth. As we imagine the quiet scriptorium, the careful hand tracing letters onto fragile parchment, we can almost hear the soft scratch of the quill and feel the warmth of the candlelight flickering in the stillness. These scholars remind us that even in times that seem dark, there are always those who tend to the light, patient, humble, and steadfast. And so, as we continue our journey through history, let us carry with us the gentle knowledge that the progress of humanity is often nurtured, not by great leaps alone, but by the steady, enduring work of those who preserve, reflect, and quietly dream. In the midst of a Europe often marked by uncertainty and upheaval, monasteries stood as quiet sanctuaries, islands of calm where the pursuit of knowledge and spiritual reflection intertwined. These monastic communities were more than places of prayer. They were centers of learning, art, and preservation, carefully tended by monks whose daily rhythms balanced devotion with scholarship. Imagine stepping into a monastery in the early medieval period. The thick stone walls rise, sturdy against the harsh winds and wandering armies beyond. Inside, the air is cool and still, scented faintly with incense and the faint aroma of worn parchment. Here, Life moves with a measured calm, broken by the ringing of bells marking times of prayer, study, and rest. Within these walls, monks gathered in cloisters, peaceful courtyards enclosed by arched walkways, where they would read, meditate, and copied texts by the light of flickering candles. Their scriptoria rooms dedicated to writing were filled with rows of desks, each one occupied by a scribe carefully transcribing ancient manuscripts. The careful scratch of quills filled the silence, accompanied by occasional whispered readings of sacred or scholarly texts. Monasteries served as libraries, preserving scrolls and codices that held the fragile wisdom of the ancients. They housed texts on theology, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and the arts, all painstakingly copied by hand to ensure their survival. But the role of these monasteries extended beyond mere preservation. They were places of education, training new generations of monks and clergy in the art of reading, writing, and contemplation. Here, Latin was taught, and lessons in logic and rhetoric prepared students for roles within the church and the wider world. Many monasteries cultivated gardens, not only for food but for medicinal herbs. Monks carefully tended these plants, drawing upon ancient texts and local knowledge to create remedies that healed the sick in their communities. In times of war and unrest, monasteries often offered refuge, not only for their own members, but for travelers and local villagers. Their fortified walls and isolated locations provided safety from marauding armies and bandits. These sanctuaries became anchors of stability in a world where kingdoms rose and fell, and borders shifted like sand. The daily lives of the monks were shaped by a balance of work and prayer, study and service. The rule of Saint Benedict, one of the most influential monastic guidelines, emphasized this harmony, encouraging a life of humility, discipline, and learning. Within this gentle structure, knowledge could be nurtured even as the world beyond seemed chaotic. It is no surprise that many of the greatest medieval scholars found their homes in such monasteries, places where the long nights were lit not only by candles but by the light of learning. Through centuries of political upheaval, invasions, and social change, these monastic sanctuaries remained beacons of continuity. Their contribution to the preservation and growth of knowledge cannot be overstated. They bridged the ancient world and the future, quietly shaping the intellectual landscape of Europe. As we imagine these monasteries, let us picture not just stone and parchment, but the steady heartbeat of human curiosity and devotion in their calm and careful hands. The fragile threads of history were woven into a tapestry that continues to inspire and inform us today. Picture a quiet evening in a distant monastery. Long ago, the sun has slipped below the horizon, and outside, the world grows dark and still. Inside, the great stone walls shelter a sanctuary of calm. In a small chamber, a single candle flickers softly, casting gentle shadows across worn wooden desks and rows of ancient books. Here sits Brother Anselm, a monk devoted to the sacred task of copying manuscripts. His hands move slowly and carefully, guided by years of practice and deep respect for the fragile parchment before him. The quill he holds dips into ink made from oak galls and soot, a precious resource carefully saved. Each letter he traces is deliberate, a quiet act of devotion as much as scholarship. The only sounds are the soft scratching of his quill and the occasional rustle of pages turning. Outside, the distant howl of wind through the cloister reminds him of the harshness beyond these walls, a world often filled with turmoil, war, and uncertainty. But within this small room, time seems to slow. Brother Anselm's eyes adjusted to the candlelight, read carefully from the original text, perhaps a passage of ancient philosophy, a prayer, or a lesson in natural science. His task is to preserve these words, to carry their wisdom safely through the generations yet to come. He knows the weight of his work. Each copy might be the only surviving version of a precious text. Mistakes could mean loss of meaning. Carelessness could mean a treasure lost to time. Though his task is quiet and humble, it is no less important than the grandest endeavors of kings and warriors as he writes. His mind drifts gently, imagining the long line of scribes before him, the monks, who labored through centuries to protect knowledge, faith, and culture. In this moment, Brother Anselm is not just a copyist. He is a guardian of history. The candle burns low, but the light in this small chamber continues, a symbol of human curiosity and dedication, flickering softly against the vast dark. And as the night deepens, the monastery sleeps, while the work of preservation quietly marches on. As we gently shift our focus from grand ideas and learned monks to the daily rhythms of life in the Dark Ages, we find ourselves immersed in a world shaped by simple routines, quiet labor, and enduring traditions. Let us begin with the peasants, the vast majority of people who toiled from dawn till dusk to sustain their communities. In villages scattered across the countryside, families lived in small, humble homes made of wood and thatch. Their days began with the soft glow of morning light, waking to tend to fields and animals. Farming was the backbone of their existence. Plowing, sowing, and harvesting were seasonal rituals that demanded strength, patience, and cooperation. Tools were basic but sturdy, wooden plows pulled by oxen, hand-forged sickles for cutting grain, and simple hoes for tilling the earth. The work was hard, the hours long, yet it followed the natural rhythms of the land. Between sowing and harvest, there were moments for repairing fences, gathering firewood, or preparing food. Meals were simple, often based on bread, vegetables, and occasionally cheese or salted meat. Fresh meat was a rare luxury. Food preservation was crucial to survive the cold winter's top. Community life revolved around the church, which stood at the village's heart. Sundays and holy days brought rest and gathering for worship, storytelling, and fellowship. Peasants' lives were marked by cycles of work and worship, each supporting the other in a fragile balance. Turning now to the knights, the warriors, who rode out from castles and manors to protect lands and uphold the feudal order. Their days began differently, shaped by training and duty. A young squire, often starting in his early teens, learned the arts of combat and horsemanship under the guidance of experienced knights. He practiced with wooden swords, learned to care for armor and weapons, and studied the codes of chivalry that bound knights to honor, loyalty, and protection. When not engaged in battle or tournament, knights oversaw their estates, ensuring the peasants fulfilled their obligations and that defenses were maintained. Despite their martial role, knights also lived within a strict social and religious framework. They attended Mass regularly, participated in festivals, and upheld the churches. Teachings. Armor and weapons were expensive, symbols not only of power but of responsibility. A knight's reputation depended as much on his conduct as on his prowess in battle. Life at court or in a manor included feasts, music, and tournaments, moments of celebration and display, but these were balanced by long periods of preparation and vigilance. And finally, the monks, men who chose a life of contemplation, prayer, and service within the walls of monasteries. Their daily rhythm was ruled by the canonical hours, a series of prayers and chants spaced throughout the day and night. Rising often before dawn, monks gathered in the chapel for matins, the first prayer of the day. This was followed by periods of manual labor, study, and communal meals. Their work varied. Some tended gardens and fields, growing food and medicinal herbs. Others copied manuscripts or engaged in teaching. Monastic life was marked by discipline and simplicity. Wealth was eschewed and possessions were few. The day was carefully structured to balance prayer, work, and rest. Yet within these walls, a vibrant intellectual life flourished. Monks debated theology, studied natural phenomena, and preserved the wisdom of past civilizations. The monastery was both a spiritual retreat and a hub of learning. Together, peasants, knights, and monks formed the tapestry of medieval society, each fulfilling roles that sustained the whole. Though their worlds differed, they were united by shared faith, customs, and an acceptance of life's hardships and joys. In the quiet moments between work and worship, these people found meaning and community, a reminder that even in times called dark, the light of daily life shone steadily on. As we continue to explore daily life in the Dark Ages, it becomes clear that the Church was not merely a place of worship, but a pervasive presence that shaped every moment of people's lives. From the meals they ate to the celebrations and ceremonies that marked the passage of time. Meals, for instance, were infused with religious significance. The rhythms of fasting and feasting followed the Church's calendar closely. Certain days called for abstinence, no meat, and sometimes no food at all during daylight hours. Lent, a season of 40 days leading to Easter, was a particularly solemn time of fasting and reflection. On feast days, however, the tables were laden with special foods, and the community gathered not only to nourish their bodies, but to celebrate. Shared faith and gratitude, blessings before and after meals were customary, a reminder that sustenance was a gift from God. Food itself was often simple: bread, cheese, vegetables, and occasionally salted or smoked meats. But its preparation and consumption were acts of devotion. The Church also played a central role in festivals, which punctuated the calendar with moments of joy, reflection, and community bonding. Saints, feast days, Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost were occasions for elaborate ceremonies, processions, and communal gatherings. Villagers and townsfolk alike would dress in their finest clothes, gather in the churchyard or town square, and partake in music, dancing, and storytelling. These festivals were times to renew social ties, express collective identity, and connect the earthly with the divine. Many traditions that began in these medieval celebrations have echoes in modern holidays, reminding us of their enduring legacy. Weddings, too, were deeply influenced by the Church's teachings and rituals. Marriage was considered a sacred sacrament, a covenant not only between two individuals, but also with God. Ceremonies were conducted within the Church, officiated by a priest who blessed the union and guided the couple in their new life together. The vows exchanged were solemn promises, binding the couple in faith and mutual responsibility. Community gatherings followed, with feasts and celebrations that could last for days, reinforcing the social fabric. Funerals, while somber, were equally shaped by religious belief. The Church provided rites to honor the deceased and offer comfort to the living, prayers for the soul's journey, masses for the dead, and burial in consecrated ground were central practices. These rituals reflected a deep hope in the afterlife and the possibility of salvation. They also brought the community together in shared grief and remembrance. Through these moments, meals, festivals, weddings, and funerals, the Church's influence was woven into the very fabric of medieval life. It shaped how people understood their world, their relationships, and their place within a larger cosmic order. Even the passing of time itself was marked by the Church's calendar, which divided the year into seasons of fasting and feasting, reflection and celebration. In this way, the Church provided a rhythm and structure that helped communities navigate the uncertainties of daily life. As we imagine these moments softly unfolding in village halls, churchyards, and humble homes, we see a world where faith was not separate from life, but deeply embedded in it. And as night falls over this long-past world, it is in these shared traditions that the warmth of community and belief gently endures. As we continue to drift through the everyday life of the Dark Ages, one truth becomes ever clearer. Religion was the heartbeat of the world around them. Faith was not confined to moments of formal worship, but was woven seamlessly into the fabric of daily existence, from the earliest light of dawn to the quiet moments before sleep. Prayers and religious observances punctuated the day. Monks and peasants alike would rise with the call to prayer, their lives structured by the canonical hours. A series of prayers said at specific times throughout the day and night. These moments created a rhythm that connected individuals to their community and to the divine. Holy days were landmarks in this spiritual landscape. Each day held meaning, but some were especially sacred. Feast days dedicated to saints, celebrations of events in the life of Christ, and solemn periods of fasting and penance. These days offered relief from the toils of daily labor and a chance for communal gathering. Easter, the celebration of resurrection and renewal, was the most significant feast of all, inspiring joyous rituals and traditions. Christmas brought light to the darkest days of winter, with candlelit ceremonies and heartfelt hymns throughout the year. The Church's calendar guided not only religious observance, but social and agricultural life as well. Planting and harvesting were often timed to coincide with specific feast days, believed to hold blessings for the land and the people. Religious festivals blended sacred ritual with communal joy, processions winding through villages, the ringing of church bells calling the faithful together, and simple acts of charity extended to the poor. These holy days were more than ceremonies. They were anchors of hope and continuity in a world often marked by uncertainty. Religious imagery and symbols were everywhere in the crosses worn around necks, the icons displayed in homes, and the small shrines at crossroads or fields. For many, these symbols offered comfort and protection, reminders of a divine presence watching over their daily struggles. Even the darkest moments, such as illness or loss, were softened by faith. Prayers for healing and the promise of eternal life gave strength to endure. Through these practices, the Church shaped not only spiritual life, but the very way people understood the world, a place imbued with meaning and purpose. And so, as we gently close this chapter on daily life in the Dark Ages, we see a world where the sacred and the ordinary were inseparable. Faith was the lens through which all things were seen, the quiet light guiding countless souls through the long night. As the centuries passed, the vast and often turbulent landscape of Europe began to shift slowly, like the gentle turning of a great wheel. The long shadows of the so-called Dark Ages started to lift, revealing new possibilities renewed energy, and fresh ideas. This was not a sudden awakening, but a gradual transformation, a subtle unfolding of change that wove together many threads: social, cultural, political, and intellectual. Small towns grew larger, and trade routes expanded, connecting distant regions with new goods and ideas. Markets buzzed with activity, as merchants from near and far exchanged cloth, spices, metals, and stories. The feudal system, which had structured society through bonds of loyalty and land, evolved. Lords and vassals continued to shape the political landscape, but emerging monarchies began to consolidate power, laying the groundwork for nations that would one day become modern countries. Amidst these changes, the Church itself adapted. It remained a central institution, but increasingly fostered education and cultural growth. Monasteries gave rise to early universities, places where scholars gathered to study not only theology but also law, medicine, and philosophy. The written word gained new importance as the use of Latin expanded beyond clerical circles, touching more of society. Architecturally, the period blossomed with the emergence of Gothic cathedrals. These soaring structures, with their pointed arches, flying buttresses, and stained glass windows, were not merely buildings, but expressions of faith reaching toward the heavens. They became centers of community life, or an artistic achievement. At the same time, intellectual curiosity began to stir. Thinkers sought to reconcile faith with reason, drawing upon ancient texts rediscovered through contact with the wider world, including the Islamic world's preservation and expansion of classical knowledge. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas worked to weave together theology and philosophy, laying the foundation for new ways of understanding. This period also saw the revival of the arts and literature. Vernacular languages began to flourish in poetry and song, capturing the lives and dreams of common people and nobles alike. Chivalry, the code that guided knights, blended martial prowess with courtly manners and ideals of honor and love. Yet, this blossoming was not without challenges. Conflicts persisted between emerging kingdoms, within the Church itself, and with neighboring peoples. The Crusades, military expeditions to the Holy Land, reflected both religious fervor and political ambitions. Despite these struggles, the overall trajectory was one of renewal and growth. The long night was giving way to dawn. Europe was awakening to a new era, one marked by greater stability, richer culture, and expanding horizons. As we softly step forward into this period, we sense the stirring of hope and the quiet promise that the past, with all its trials, was preparing the ground for a brighter future. As Europe's landscape gently shifted from the early medieval period into the high Middle Ages, new centers of learning began to take shape, heralding a slow but steady revival of intellectual curiosity. At the heart of this transformation was the emergence of universities, institutions that would become the cornerstones of education for centuries to come. Unlike the monastic schools of earlier times, these universities were often situated in growing cities, where scholars and students from various regions gathered to share knowledge. The University of Bologna in Italy, founded around 1088, is often considered the oldest university in the Western world. It specialized in law and attracted students eager to learn about Roman and canon law. Shortly thereafter, the University of Paris emerged as a major center for theology and philosophy, influencing thinkers across Europe. These universities offered structured curricula, with degrees that certified mastery in fields such as the liberal arts, medicine, and theology. They fostered a vibrant intellectual community, where debate, questioning, and the exchange of ideas were encouraged, albeit within the bounds of prevailing religious doctrine. Meanwhile, the art and architecture of the time blossomed into the distinctive style known as Gothic, a marked departure from the heavier, earthbound Romanesque forms. Gothic cathedrals soared with their pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, allowing builders to reach unprecedented heights and fill interiors with light. Stained glass windows told biblical stories in vibrant colors, casting ethereal light on stone floors and walls. These cathedrals were not only places of worship, but also centers of civic pride and community gathering. They reflected a renewed confidence and a desire to reach toward the divine, both physically and spiritually. In the same period, intellectual curiosity began to awaken in new ways. Scholars sought to reconcile faith with reason, inspired by the rediscovery of classical texts preserved in monasteries and through contact with the Islamic world, where philosophers such as Avicenna and Averroes had expanded upon ancient knowledge. This cross-cultural exchange introduced Europeans to Aristotle's works and new scientific ideas that challenged old assumptions. Philosophers, like Thomas Aquinas, endeavored to create a harmonious relationship between Christian doctrine and Aristotelian philosophy, laying the groundwork for scholasticism. This method of inquiry emphasized rigorous dialectical reasoning and became the dominant mode of academic thought beyond the universities and cathedrals. Literature and the arts flourished. Epic poems, courtly romances, and lyrical songs began to be written in vernacular languages, the everyday tongues of the people, rather than exclusively in Latin. This made stories accessible to wider audiences and enriched cultural life. The ideals of chivalry and courtly love permeated these works, reflecting evolving social values and aspirations. Together, the rise of universities, the brilliance of Gothic art, and the rekindling of intellectual curiosity signaled a Europe slowly emerging from the shadows of its earlier centuries. It was a time when the thirst for knowledge and beauty began to illuminate the path forward, gently lifting the continent toward the Renaissance that lay ahead. As we reflect softly on the slow and steady changes unfolding across medieval Europe, it feels as though a long, quiet night was beginning to give way to the first gentle light of dawn. The centuries once thought of as the Dark Ages were not merely a time of shadows and loss, but also a period of resilience, adaptation, and the laying of foundations for future growth. In the stillness of monasteries, the flicker of candlelight illuminated the pages of manuscripts, preserving the wisdom of ancient civilizations. In the stone and glass of soaring cathedrals, faith found new expression, reaching ever upwards. Communities across the land, bound by faith and tradition, found ways to endure hardships and celebrate moments of joy. Trade and towns slowly grew, weaving new connections between distant peoples. In classrooms and lecture halls, the thirst for knowledge began to awaken anew. The rise of universities marked a turning point, places where scholars, inspired by both faith and reason, sought to understand the world with fresh eyes. Philosophers and theologians wrestled with big questions, not dismissing doubt, but embracing it as a step toward deeper understanding. The arts blossomed, bringing color and story to everyday life, while the beauty of Gothic cathedrals reflected a hopeful reaching for something beyond. Though challenges remained, wars, plagues, and conflicts, the spirit of progress quietly stirred beneath the surface. Perhaps The long night was not simply a time of darkness, but a slow, patient preparation. The soil was being tilled, the seeds planted, ready to bloom in the centuries to come. And so, as we gently close this chapter of history, we might imagine the first soft glow of morning light, hinting at a new day on the horizon. It is a reminder that history is never simply one story, but a tapestry woven from many threads, some bright, some shadowed, all part of the human journey. In this way, the past invites us to listen quietly, to reflect gently, and to carry forward the lessons of resilience and hope. As we arrive at one of the most thoughtful questions of our journey, did the Church truly suppress progress during the medieval era? It is important to approach this with a gentle, open mind, acknowledging the complexity beneath the surface. Many historians and thinkers have pointed to moments when the Church exerted strict control over knowledge and ideas, at times limiting exploration and innovation in ways that seem restrictive from our modern perspective. One of the key ways this suppression manifested was through censorship. The Church maintained authority over what could be taught, written, or discussed, especially when ideas appeared to conflict with established doctrine. Books and manuscripts that challenged religious teachings were often banned or destroyed. The printing press had yet to be invented, so the copying of texts was a carefully controlled and slow process, mostly carried out in monasteries under church supervision. This monopoly over information allowed the Church to filter knowledge and restrict access to certain scientific or philosophical concepts. Control extended beyond literature into education and public discourse. Universities, many of which were under church auspices, offered curricula aligned with theological teachings. Scholarly debate was encouraged only within limits, deemed acceptable by religious authorities. Ideas that questioned fundamental beliefs risked condemnation, or worse, such restrictions discouraged free inquiry and innovation, creating an environment where fear of heresy stifled creativity. Another aspect of suppression was the persecution of individuals who challenged church doctrine. Famous examples, although from later periods, such as Galileo, Galilei, and Giordano Bruno, illustrate how the Church reacted to scientific theories or philosophies that contradicted its teachings. Their trials and punishments sent powerful signals that dissent could be dangerous, even in earlier medieval times. Thinkers who proposed alternative views risked censure or exile. This climate of control and fear inevitably slowed the pace of scientific and intellectual progress. Inventors, natural philosophers, and artists often had to navigate carefully, balancing curiosity with caution. Moreover, the Church's emphasis on spiritual matters sometimes led to skepticism about worldly knowledge. Practical experimentation and empirical observation were not always encouraged, as faith and revelation held primacy. This preference sometimes placed constraints on scientific inquiry. In addition, certain fields of knowledge, such as astrology or natural magic, were viewed with suspicion and suppressed, even when they overlapped with early scientific thought. This created boundaries around acceptable knowledge and curtailed some lines of exploration. Yet, it is important to remember that this suppression did not extinguish curiosity or innovation entirely. Rather, it shaped the context in which progress occurred. While the Church's authority could impose limits, it also preserved a core of knowledge and fostered intellectual activity within its own framework. Nevertheless, when considering this perspective, it becomes clear that censorship, control, and suppression were significant forces that influenced the trajectory of human progress during the medieval period. They created a tension between faith and reason, tradition and innovation, that defined much of the era's intellectual life. And so, as we reflect gently on this view, we recognize the challenges faced by those who sought to expand the boundaries of knowledge in a world where belief and authority were deeply intertwined. As we continue to explore the complex role of the Church in medieval times, it is important to remember another perspective, one that highlights the Church's role not as a suppressor, but as a guardian of knowledge and a foundation for learning. During the centuries often labeled as the Dark Ages, many ancient texts might have been lost forever were it not for the diligent work of monks and scholars within. Church walls, monasteries, served as sanctuaries where manuscripts from Greek, Roman, and early Christian authors were carefully copied and preserved. These texts included works on philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and natural science, the intellectual heritage of earlier civilizations. Without this preservation, the foundation for future European scholarship might have been far weaker. The painstaking process of transcription was more than clerical work. It was an act of devotion and intellectual stewardship. Monks worked in scriptoria, rooms filled with the soft glow of candles and the quiet scratching of quills, faithfully reproducing texts so they could survive through generations. This tradition safeguarded a treasure trove of knowledge through times of instability and conflict. Beyond preservation, the Church also laid the groundwork for education itself. Many of the earliest European universities grew from cathedral schools and monastic centers. These institutions provided a structured setting where young minds could engage with theology, philosophy, and the liberal arts. The curriculum often included logic, grammar, rhetoric, and later, natural philosophy. While theology remained central, these schools nurtured intellectual rigor and inquiry. The Church's role in founding universities, like those in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, demonstrates its commitment to education. These centers became hubs of learning, attracting scholars from across Europe. Though the Church maintained doctrinal boundaries, within those limits, scholars debated, questioned, and expanded their understanding of the world. Moreover, the Church was a patron of the arts and sciences. Clerics commissioned works of art, supported the study of music, and contributed to the development of architecture, as seen in the magnificent cathedrals that still inspire awe today. They also encouraged the study of medicine and natural philosophy within the context of faith. The relationship between faith and reason was complex, but not always antagonistic. Thinkers, like Thomas Aquinas, sought to harmonize the two, demonstrating that religious belief and intellectual inquiry could coexist. The Church's libraries and collections preserved and made accessible important works, acting as centers for learning rather than barriers. In this light, the medieval Church emerges not only as a religious authority, but also as a cultural institution vital to the transmission of knowledge. It provided stability and continuity during times when much of Europe was fragmented and uncertain. By maintaining educational institutions and safeguarding texts, the Church laid the groundwork for the intellectual flowering that would come in the Renaissance and beyond. So, while there were moments of restriction and conflict, it is equally true that the Church played a crucial role in nurturing the seeds of progress. It was both protector and teacher, a guardian of a fragile but enduring legacy. As we gently reflect on this perspective, we appreciate the balance and complexity of history, recognizing that progress often comes through preservation as much as innovation. As we come to the close of this thoughtful exploration, it is natural to wonder What should we believe about the Church's role in history? Was it a force that held back progress, or a guardian that preserved knowledge through turbulent times? Perhaps the most gentle and honest answer is that history is rarely so simple. It is woven with complexities, contradictions, and shades of meaning that invite us not to rush toward judgment, but to pause and reflect. The Church, like any great institution, contained multitudes. At times, it imposed limits and resisted change. At others, it fostered learning and protected precious wisdom. People lived, struggled, and dreamed within its reach, shaping their world in ways that are not easily categorized. This moment invites us to sit quietly with the questions rather than demand definitive answers, to appreciate that progress is not a straight path, but a winding journey marked by pauses, setbacks, and surprising leaps forward. It reminds us that what may seem like darkness can also be a time of preparation, resilience, and slow growth beneath the surface. As you gently listen to this story from a distant past, consider the ways in which history's layers inform our present. Reflect on the delicate balance between tradition and innovation, authority and freedom, faith and reason, and perhaps in this quiet contemplation we find a deeper understanding, not just of the past, but of the ongoing human story in which we all take part. So let us leave these thoughts like soft whispers in the night, inviting rest and peace, while the mind gently wanders through the vast tapestry of history, open to wonder and reflection. As we come to the close of our gentle journey through the centuries, it feels fitting to softly gather together the threads of the story we have shared. We began by stepping quietly into a world long past the time often called the Dark Ages, a period when Europe was reshaped by great change and uncertainty. We explored how, after the fall of the Roman Empire, the continent was marked by turmoil and upheaval, yet also by the slow emergence of new centers of power and stability. The Church rose as a guiding presence, weaving itself deeply into the lives of ordinary people, shaping their days, their beliefs, and their communities. We saw how faith became a lens through which life was understood, influencing everything from meals and festivals to weddings and funerals. At the same time, the Church became the steward of knowledge, preserving ancient texts in quiet monasteries and fostering education through early universities. Yet, the story was not without tension. There were moments when the Church's authority limited free inquiry and resisted ideas that challenged established beliefs. The balance between suppression and preservation was delicate and complex. We met scholars and thinkers who worked quietly in candlelit rooms, safeguarding wisdom while cautiously pushing boundaries. We witnessed the slow awakening of intellectual curiosity, the rise of Gothic cathedrals reaching toward the heavens, and the blossoming of art and culture that hinted at a new dawn. The transition to the High Middle Ages was a time of renewal, when Europe gradually moved from the shadows toward a future bright with possibility. We also reflected on the enduring debate. Did the Church suppress progress, or did it protect the fragile flame of knowledge through uncertain times? The answer, as we gently considered, is not simple. History invites us to hold both perspectives in balance, appreciating the complexities and contradictions that shaped an era. And so, as we close this chapter, we carry with us a deeper understanding that progress is not a straight path, but a tapestry woven from many strands. Faith and reason, tradition and innovation, darkness and light. Perhaps it is through this interplay that the story of humanity unfolds, full of challenge, resilience, and hope as you settle into rest. May this reflection bring a sense of peace and wonder. May the soft echoes of the past gently fade into dreams, carrying with them the quiet assurance that even the longest nights eventually give way. To dawn, thank you for joining this journey through time. Sleep well, and let the story of history's gentle unfolding guide you into calm and restful night. As we gently bring this story to a close, it feels important to remember that history is never simple. It is a tapestry, rich and intricate, woven from countless threads that intertwine in ways both expected and surprising. The past holds many truths, some shining brightly, others cast in shadow. Events and people cannot be neatly sorted into good or bad, light or dark. Instead, they exist in the soft spaces between, full of nuance and depth. The story we have explored of the Church and human progress is a perfect example of this complexity. Within the same chapters, we find preservation and suppression, faith and reason, limitation and possibility. The Church was both a protector of ancient wisdom and, at times, a guardian that held tightly to tradition. It shaped lives in ways both comforting and constraining. And so it is with all history. A dance between opposing forces, a mosaic of experiences that resist simple judgment. This complexity invites us not only to learn facts, but also to listen deeply to the whispers and echoes of those who came before us. By embracing the multifaceted nature of the past, we open ourselves to greater understanding and compassion. We recognize that progress is rarely a straight path, and that every age has its struggles and triumphs. So, as you drift gently toward rest, carry with you this thought: history is a living story, ever unfolding, always rich with mystery. It holds lessons, not just in what was done, but in the questions left behind. May this awareness bring a quiet peace, a soft curiosity, and a gentle hope as you journey onward into dreams and into your own unfolding story. As we slowly return from our journey through time, gently stepping back into the present moment, it is worth pausing to reflect on what these centuries teach us. Perhaps it is because of those long nights, the times of uncertainty, challenge, and quiet endurance, that today's light feels all the more precious. The comforts and freedoms we experience now shine brighter when seen against the backdrop of history's shadows. Our world, with all its complexity, is built upon the patience, resilience, and hope of countless generations. In this way, the past is never truly distant. It lives within us, shaping the light we walk in each day. So, as you settle into rest, allow yourself to appreciate the gentle glow of today's dawn. May it bring warmth to your heart and calm to your mind. And may the stories of history's long nights remind you that even in the darkest times, light waits patiently to return. Sleep peacefully, and let this quiet thought carry you softly into your dreams. And now, as our gentle journey comes to a close, I wish you a night filled with peace and calm. May your mind find rest in the soft embrace of quiet moments, and your heart be soothed by gentle thoughts. Let the stories of the past drift softly into your dreams, like whispers carried on a tender breeze. In this stillness, may you feel a deep sense of comfort and renewal. Know that each night is a time to gather strength, to heal, and to prepare for the new day ahead. So, as you close your eyes, breathe slowly and deeply, letting go of all worries and cares. Allow yourself to sink into restful sleep, wrapped in warmth and tranquility. Thank you for sharing this time and story with me. Sleep well, dear listener, and wake refreshed, ready to greet the morning light with a calm and hopeful heart. Good night.